Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to kick off now. So firstly, thanks for coming and welcome to our presentation on accessibility and EdTech for inclusion. So what I'm going to talk about today, alongside my colleague Becca, is some accessibility tools that we use at the college. But also I'm going to be looking at EdTech and how we use it in general to promote inclusive learning and teaching environments. So first of all, who is accessibility for? Now, obviously, when we think about accessibility in terms of EdTech, we're particularly thinking about how we can support learners with additional needs. We're thinking about supporting learners for whom English isn't their first language, but also a lot of general good practice when it comes to accessibility in web and digital benefits everybody. And hopefully some of the examples that you'll see throughout our slides will show you how things that we may have introduced for the purpose of meeting an access need can actually just have benefits for everyone in the class. So in terms of the structure of the webinar today, firstly, I'm going to go through a little bit of the strategy that we use at BCoT. So for context, for those who don't know me, I'm a senior learning technologist at the college, and I'm part of our BCoT Digital team. So our team support teaching and learning across the college in terms of training teachers and students to use digital tools, creating digital materials, and also supporting the use of technology throughout the course of studies. So in terms of digital accessibility, this is something that we've tried to embed throughout our digital strategy. And this is a journey that we probably started on about 3 years ago. We started having a real focus on digital accessibility. And at this point, the main reason that we began focusing on it is because we realized we didn't have anyone who was a specialist in digital accessibility in the college. We were looking at different tools that could be used to support accessibility for our digital learning, but we didn't have a kind of go-to person who could provide training, keep up to date with how these tools could best be used and applied across our student body. So the first point for us in terms of building a strategy was identifying the weaknesses that we had as a college and resource and training needs. The second point on strategy was that we wanted to make sure that once we'd identified accessibility as a point of importance for our digital strategy, things were accessible by default. So this meant setting the standard for all of our digital materials. Now, whether that was making sure that our materials are all WCAG compliant, or just making sure that teaching environments were set up in a way which were flexible enough to be changed to meet learner needs. The second strand of our journey was building awareness. So a really big part of what we've been doing in our team is actually just building awareness among our staff in particular about what tools are out there. So as I'm going to cover later in the presentation, there's lots of accessibility tools and features built into Google for Education and Microsoft for Education tools. But what we found is a lot of teachers didn't know about these, and therefore their students didn't know about them or how to use them. So a big part of embedding digital accessibility wasn't about buying in external resources or software, but it was actually about doing an audit of what we already had and making sure people were aware. Next of all was advertising support and advice. So this is more advertising it towards students, but also, as I'll show you on the next slide, a little bit about advertising sort of best practice to staff as well. And then I've got communication between key teams and figures. So as I said, I sit within the digital team and we're in the teaching and learning and quality department. But since taking on a lot of the accessibility work at the college, I've worked quite closely with our learner support team to make sure that what we're doing aligns and we can have a joint up strategy where we can both bring our knowledge and skills to support the learners. And then the final strand is having ongoing support. So this is some of the things that we'll look at what we've embedded at BCoT. So having named persons is the first one. Having resources and toolkits which can be accessed going forwards. And then also adapting and changing. So in particular, when my colleague Becca shows you some of her examples, that has some great examples of how since her student demographics have changed, a lot of the practice that they do in the department has changed as well. So on the first point of having a strategy, as I mentioned before, one of our biggest weaknesses when we started looking at how we were practicing accessibility in the college was that we didn't have any specialist knowledge. Now, one thing that's really easy and free for anyone to do who feels like they need to bring more specialist knowledge into their organisation is joining CPD communities. Techability is a website and an organisation which I would highly recommend. So when I was a learning technologist about 3 years ago, before I had much of an idea about accessibility and what that meant in the context of EdTech, I went to the Techability conference and I learned probably more in that day than I could have learned in a year just reading articles online. Brilliant organisation. JISC also has some brilliant accessibility communications. So I can share the links afterwards, but they have an email group which you can sign up to where they just share best practice, resources, and you can also just ask questions if you have specific needs that you're trying to cater to and you're not sure where to look for advice. And finally, Twitter. Twitter is where I've learned an awful lot. So using the hashtags like hashtag accessibility or hashtag A11Y, which is a kind of shortcut for accessibility. Loads of fantastic people in the EdTech accessibility sphere are constantly sharing their resources, tips, advice on Twitter. So that's a goldmine for resources. So on the next point of accessibility by default, one thing that we decided to do here is to use accessibility checkers. And in our case, we use mostly Google tools, so Google Docs, Slides, Sheets. And my go-to checker is one called Grackle Docs. That's a Chrome extension. Again, if anyone wants me to share the links afterwards, I can do that. And essentially, you add the extension, and then when you create a Google Doc or a Google Slides, you can run that extension and it will do a check on your accessibility, the accessibility of your document. So for example, it would be looking for things as like whether you have headers, whether you've added alt text to your images for people using screen readers, whether your color contrast is to the desired standard. Now, automated accessibility checkers obviously are not a replacement for sort of doing due diligence when creating things and getting in best practice for yourself. But in terms of when we first started looking at retrospectively adapting our resources and then making sure we were setting a high standard going forwards, they were a really useful tool. For anyone here who uses Microsoft as well, if you're in Word, PowerPoint, etc., in the review tab of the ribbon, there's an accessibility feature built in there. So it's a really good habit to get into, which we try to instill across our team in particular, because we create a lot of resources, but also amongst teachers. So awareness, as I said, staff training was a key one to start with. And first of all, that was just generalized staff training. So just making sure that staff were aware of what accessibility features were available that we had access to as a college. Now, again, mostly for our college, that was looking at the accessibility features through Google for Education. But also we used some software called Read and Write, which you may or may not be familiar with. So it was showing everybody that, giving them an overview of what it could do, just so that if they have a learner who they identify might find that software useful, they know where to point them. And then we had specific training for key teams as well. So as I mentioned, I've worked quite closely with our learner support team. And in terms of going through software like Read and Write and all of the accessibility features on Chromebooks, for example, I've done numerous training sessions with them where I can go a lot more in depth about what different tools might be useful for different needs. And then also it means that they can just bring to me what they find that learners are struggling with. Working with our learner support team has been fantastic because they really are the heartbeat of an organisation. They have the student-facing time. They see different students across all courses. So I would highly recommend, if you're the person in charge of digital accessibility at your organisation, or if you're someone who is a key stakeholder who can help build that strategy, to make sure you're linking up your learner support team with your digital support. So the next part is advertising support and advice. Now, I'm just going to open up 2 guides here, and these aren't things we've created ourselves. So this first one is something that's on offer from Google for Education. Now, these flashcards we found a while ago on Google for Education's blog, and essentially they just cover some of the key accessibility features on Chromebooks. Now, in a lot of our classrooms and in our Learning Hub as well, we have Chromebooks which the students have access to. So instead of, well, in addition to sort of training our students and having sort of posters and things about how to use things, we thought if we just put how-to guides right out in the library, we have them in like double-sided plastic stands and pop them on the tables, then that means that learners can actually access this and look at how to do these things themselves. Now, at BCoT, we're a post-16 organisation. A lot of our students are used to learning and working independently and don't necessarily want to have to go to somebody special to get advice and support, or to sort of say, like, is there anything I can use for this? And particularly when we're looking at our part-time or adult students who are earning even less, they might not just have the time to come along and see us. So by having really clear messaging around a lot of the shared areas about how they can use the different features which are built into the devices, we found that a lot of learners have been able to just pick this up and use them independently without needing support necessarily. Yes, absolutely. I will pop a link in now, actually. So I'm going to pop this in the chat, but I'll also, if anyone wants a list of all the resources I show in this afterwards, I can send those out. Now, if I come back to the presentation quickly. So that's something that we've put around, which is useful for our learners. And we also have some guides on read and write. So read and write, and I'll talk a little bit more on that later, is something that we try and recommend all of our learners use. We don't like to look at it as just a piece of additional software for some of our learners, because it's got such a broad set of tools in it. We kind of just give it as part of their digital pencil case. Now, another thing that we use, and I've got these posted up in my office and also in a few staff rooms, is targeted more at staff. Now, I shared that tab, yeah. So these posters I come across a few years ago again, and these were actually designed by Home Office Digital, and they're about designing for accessibility. So one thing that we found as well is that obviously a lot of staff are using resources they've used for a long time, or they're creating new things in a rush, and accessibility just isn't going to be on the top of everyone's agenda when they're creating resources. So when I came across these, we thought it was a really good way to be able to have just visual reminders around staff rooms, around the college, about how to design whilst bearing in mind how to make it suitable for learners with additional needs. Now, this guide, again, I'll share the link for this. This was aimed more at developing software. So some of the things are about buttons and making them descriptive, but we've kind of modified them as needed, because a lot of it actually applies to learning resources that our teachers are using now. And particularly in a post-COVID era where more and more resources are online, and most of our teachers are using video to some extent, it's provided particularly useful at covering the types of things that they're creating. So these are just some really handy posters. Again, I'll pop these in the chat. But it's just having visual reminders around for people to be able to access. And then finally, communication between key teams and figures. So again, I'm sort of have been the lead on accessibility in our digital team, and the learner support team have been a team that I've worked really closely with. So once every 2 months, I go into their team meeting so that both I can give them an update on any sort of updates on the software we use, but also I can get an update from them and an understanding of what particular needs the students have at the moment. And then we also use the tutorials. So once a week, all of our learners have an hour tutorial. and one of my colleagues developed those. So in terms of putting quick tips and hits in, reminders about the kind of software that's available, we try and make sure there's a sort of multidisciplinary support there. Okay, final one on the strategy before we go on to some examples. So having named people again is really useful, and in terms of having posters and signage around the college, we have a support hub at our college where students can go for support, and then I liaise with them if students need particular like one-to-one training on any of the software, so that students just know where to go if they need the help. Resources and toolkits, we've got a few examples of these later on, but one of the things that's been really successful is having a shared drive with how-to guides for staff. So there's a lot of really useful guides out there on both accessibility in Google, in Microsoft. There's some fantastic websites dedicated to accessibility, how to make documents accessible for users with dyslexia. But what we found is I was signposting people to these resources, but it would just, people lose track of them. So what I've done is created a Google Drive and basically just put, copied a lot of the text across so that it's all in one place and can be accessed to one place. But then obviously linked to the original resources as well. And it just means that when our teachers are looking for sort of anything related to accessibility, there's just that one place they can go to. We also have a digital website for sort of general digital learning, and we're currently creating an accessibility section on that, which again is focused at support for teachers on how they can make their sort of teaching and learning accessible. We have digital toolkits for students as well. So this is something that came out of COVID in particular. So I'll show a few examples again in the next slides, but we had a lot of things that used to be things that we'd hand out at college or guides or leaflets. We've made accessible online, which was out of need during COVID, but since then we found that actually that's how our learners are accessing things now. So again, it just means it's available for anywhere, anyone. And sharing best practice ideas in Google Chat. So we use Google Chat at the college, which Becca will talk a bit about shortly as well. And we've just created, I've just been working with one of our learner support assistants, who's also an autism ambassador, on creating a chat group for staff to talk about if they're working with learners on the autistic spectrum, to share strategies and best practice, not just related to technology or digital accessibility, but it's just another way that we're trying to make sure that the way that we use tech really supports our learners in that way. And finally, adapting to the changing demographics and needs. So this can be on a sort of larger scale in terms of data trends. So obviously our sort of student demographics changing regularly, but also just listening and learning from experiences on the ground. So as I said, for me, quite often that's working with our learner support team, but also as Becca will share some examples later, even though I might be aware of lots of different accessibility tools, things that Becca's doing in practice with her learners are things that I might not have considered. So again, if you're that person working on accessibility, it's really important getting out to the different areas and seeing what teachers are doing. So I'm going to go on to what we're doing at BCoT next. Just need to make someone else. So in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using tech in general. And in the section after this, we'll look at some specific accessibility tools. But in terms of generally creating an inclusive learning environment, since our digital team was formed 5 or 6 years ago, we've been, Scott Hayden, who's my manager, first of all was using Twitter quite a lot to have engaging chats with students. Now, this was partly just a sort of experiment, seeing how it could be used for teaching and learning. But this was actually how I ended up getting involved in the sort of EdTech scene myself. When I was a student at the college, I was a very anxious student and didn't like sort of engaging in class discussions. So being able to use Twitter to engage and ask questions meant that I didn't have to put my hand up in class and stand up in front of everyone. So that was a kind of accidental, but kind of led to a lot of the things that we're doing now. And it got us thinking about how we can use tech in different ways to ease learners' anxieties when coming into the college. In the top right here, you'll see what is a Google form. And it's a really simple Google form, but it's something that I created with Tracy from our specialist provision last year, I think this was. And basically, she wanted a really quick check-in form so that her learners could give her a kind of mood check at the beginning of lessons, and give her an idea of a read of the room, if you like. Now, she works with our supported internship students, which are learners up to the age of 25 who have EHCPs. And particularly at the beginning of the academic year, which is when we created this, a lot of her learners weren't really comfortable talking to her about how they were feeling, or struggled to express their emotions. So we put this form together just as a way that students could, optionally, they didn't have to, but at the beginning of the day in their first lesson, they could log in, check a little box to say how they were feeling, which also was encouraging them to reflect on that themselves. And then at the bottom, there's just an option for if they're having any particular issues they want to talk to the teacher about. So that meant that Tracy could get a feel of the room straight away, and also in what's quite a busy department, could straight away see if there were any sort of people she needed to attend to as soon as possible. In the middle here, this was a use of Padlet, I think it was, yeah, Padlet. And this was again over in the specialist provision department. And it was when I was doing some sessions on digital citizenship. And we were looking at social media and the appropriate use of social media. So we used, again, Padlet here so that students could put up posts, and we could discuss what was a sort of good post to put online, what posts might be a bit risky, and they could discuss that in a safe environment. So for anyone who's not used Padlet, you can post posts, which is kind of like a sticky note board, and then students can log in via either Google or Microsoft and add comments and upvote and downvote. But you, as a teacher, you can set it so that they appear to each other as anonymous, but on the teacher's back end, you can still see who posted what. So again, in terms of working with learners who were particularly anxious and weren't necessarily comfortable discussing these things with their peers, it gave them a safe environment where they could practice putting their ideas forwards without worrying about judgment, and enabled us to have more open discussions on what's quite a difficult topic sometimes, and could be quite an emotional topic for some of them. In the bottom left, this is actually on Pear Deck, which you'll have seen this example if you've been to one of our other presentations. Pear Deck's something that our media teacher Scott started using, and now our English teachers are using quite a lot as well. And this feature here is actually one of the free ones available. So Pear Deck have different sort of templates that you can use. And this one's really simple. So every learner gets a cursor. They log on and join with a code, and then they can move their little blue dot along to show how they're doing. So rather than a Google form, which is a bit more anonymous, this one can be used so that the teacher can just get an instant live read of how the students are doing. That was particularly useful during online lessons during COVID. And finally up here is a tour of our specialist provision. So again, this was a really simple sort of measure that we took, and it was just me walking around following Lindsay with a camera to record all of the rooms, classrooms and area of specialist provision. We did it during lockdown so that students who would usually be able to visit way in advance to get an idea of where they were going could actually see the space. Again, that was to ease anxieties and make them more familiar with the space and the people. But it's just another example of how, when we're looking at accessibility and inclusion at the college, it's not all about using specific software or assistive technology. It's about thinking how we can embed practices which are led by learner needs into all areas of what we do. So one thing that we do a lot at the college is creating reusable resources. Now, quite often, as you can see, these are video resources. We have an example up here of Justin, our hospitality teacher, who's using one of our IPvo cameras to record a demonstration that he was doing. In the middle, this was done by James, an engineering lecturer, and he's sort of created whole lectures basically on YouTube and then timestamped them for learners to revisit. Now, when it comes to creating videos for learning resources, this is something that saves a lot of time for the teachers. It saves them repeating things, but also it means that learners who either are struggling to follow along in a lesson, if they're not having a great day, or learners who actually have a lot of time off due to illness or ongoing illnesses, it means that these resources are always available for them to access. And particularly with the video resources, our ESOL department's created a lot of these as well, because Maria, our ESOL teacher, head of ESOL, was saying that her learners were often finding that, like when they were in a lesson itself, they were sort of picking up a few words out of every sentence. But in the lessons that were recorded, they could play it back, stop it, pause it, rewind, play it at their own playback speed, and really get a lot more out of it than if they just seen it once live. Different ways of capturing evidence is also something we focus on a lot at BCoT. Now, again, there's two sides to this. One side is just something that makes it easier for the lecturer to adapt what they're doing, and it's better than having to mark a million essays. But also it means that learners can present the skills and their knowledge in the way that fits them best. So not every learner has writing as their top skill. It's not the best way that every learner can communicate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have the knowledge and the skills that their course requires. So what we found is by offering learners the option of how they submit evidence, whether that is by doing it by video. So in the top left, we have one of our automotive students who's just doing a walkthrough basically of a build that they did in the automotive department. He's hitting all the criteria that he would usually write in an assignment, but doing it this way means that he can express himself. He's still using the terminology, but it means he didn't have to just go and write it all up afterwards. We also have been focusing on using audio and podcasts, and this is something that we're going to be looking at quite a lot going forwards. So again, getting students to, particularly in the creative subjects, when they're in a sort of state of flow, rather than having the barriers which writing presents to some learners, just be able to talk and articulate their processes and what they're thinking. And there's some other examples down here, which are particularly useful for when we're trying to capture evidence live. So again, if we have learners who are doing practical vocational subjects, we try to encourage teachers to allow them to capture their evidence live rather than retrospectively, because then it means that they don't have to, their grade doesn't depend on how well they can explain their process if they have evidence that they can do it there. So in terms of digital support resources, as I said, during COVID, we put together lots of the things that we usually would have as physical resources into an online space. And since then, we found that learners can access them a lot easier this way. And it also means that we can provide different formats whenever our learners need them. Now, we'll share out these slides afterwards, and these are linked as well. I think they're all linked. So these are ones that my colleague Holly's put together. And one thing that's really useful in all of these in terms of accessibility is the use of menus so that students can jump to sections. And we also try to provide different formats for them. So we'll have documents for textual ones, but also video equivalents as well. And finally, before I hand over to Becca, is the wellbeing toolkit. So again, when we're looking at accessibility and inclusion, we want to make sure that it's really clear for our students where they can go for what kind of support. And this is another thing that came out of sort of lockdown and the need to have everything available online, really. But it's something where we've taken all of the different sort of pastoral and support that we offer at the college and put it all into one place, so that rather than having to signpost students to different areas all the time, they just have a cheat sheet, if you like, of where they can access support. Now I'm just going to hand over to Becca.
Hello, thank you. My area of specialty is art and design, and I also head up the media and games department. And we have seen a definite increase in learners with additional needs over the last few years, whether that be with educational healthcare plans or just sort of undiagnosed needs, but definitely in need of additional support. Oh, we just lost our slides, Sky. I'll keep talking while Sky's doing that. So what we've been doing within my team is looking at ways we can adapt and change our teaching and delivery and utilise some of the tools that Sky's already mentioned and some new ones in order to ensure that our students all have kind of equal access to their curriculum and the chance to kind of learn and develop their skills. And one of the things that we have used over the last couple of years is Google Chat, so the equivalent to kind of Teams, and it's made a massive difference in terms of communicating with our learners. It means that students can talk with staff individually. So if they are very anxious or concerned about anything, if maybe they lack the confidence to come and talk to us and find us in the staff room or in a classroom and say, Becca, I need to talk about this, they can message any of my team to say, this is going on, can I have a chat? You can see some quotes up here from my students with regards to how kind of chat has helped us. And I've got some examples in a second about a particular student who has selective mutism and how that's made her lessons far more accessible for her. You can also see, I think my student Katie has put on something here about our digital sketchbooks and how we have been using digital technology to help students who particularly have dyslexia or struggle with organisation to present their work and be able to organise themselves and feel much more confident about how they're producing their work and how they're using it. And there's a couple of key tools that we've been kind of using for that. So if you can go to the next slide for me, Sky, I will have a chat about it. So one of the best things that we've used that's been a real game changer for us is something called Moat, which if we play this quickly, then I'll talk it through.
Working in your favour. Well done, Kira. I think this is a really nice idea. You're getting somewhere now, definitely. So your compositions and your edits are really working in your favour, and I can see that you've got a definite concept that you're trying to get across.
Kira, thank you for submitting your digital fine artwork. There's some really interesting work in here, and I think some of your digital edits and your digital drawing in particular is really strong and is working really well. However, at the moment, I can't fully sign off this unit as completed, as there's some things which are still missing. So I'm going to...
Cool. Love hearing my own voice in stereo. Sorry about that, guys. So Moat is free software, which you can download as a Chrome extension. You can also use it embedded into Microsoft Word through other processes, which we have a load of resources on we can share with you guys if you'd like to use it. But the brilliant thing is you can record audio feedback really easily. So you can see this is one of my students' digital sketchbooks, and my colleague Pete has left a voice note attached to one of her slides, giving Kira some feedback about what she wants to do. And then the comment that I left was towards the end of her project when I was marking her work to give her some kind of summative feedback. Now, the thing that we found, especially in COVID, was that the students could hear our voices. So while we were very remote from them and it was all a little bit weird, they got a sense of, you know, what we were saying, our tone of voice, which was really important and really made them feel a lot more secure. but also a lot of my learners who do struggle with reading large banks of text and trying to kind of take that in and understand exactly what's being asked of them, find these voice notes far more successful for them. They can pause them, they can re-listen to them, they feel like they're getting the information in a really accessible way. And I think like a really friendly way as well. It's a lot more personal, and that's really helped them with their progress. You can also put a transcription in of your voice note as well. So if you want to double it up, so they've got the option to both read and listen, that's available. But the Moat software is really easy to use from a teaching perspective as well. And I've also found, on a slightly selfish note, it's made my marking much faster and my feedback much faster. So while it's also working really well for my students, it's worked really well for me and my team, which is just quite a nice win, really. And as Skye alluded to, this is not something we just use with students with additional needs. We roll this out across the whole department because actually it has been really effective for other students as well, who just, you know, need to hear my voice more in the day. So it's been really great. So if you haven't explored Moat, I'd definitely recommend it. If we go on without playing that again. Okay. So I mentioned about using Google Chat. So this is an example, or a couple of examples that you can see on the screen here, from one of my learners who has selective mutism. We've seen an increase in selective mutism within the department over the last couple of years, which I suspect is for a variety of reasons. And a lot of these students come to us having not really been able to access education effectively at secondary level. And we have worked really hard as a team to make sure that these students have the chance to achieve and also start to kind of integrate into college life. So my fantastic support, Zoe, and also my colleague Laurie, who works with her, have been supporting the student since September. We're not yet at a stage where she's comfortable to be in a classroom with the other learners, but what she will do is come into the college. She works in a separate studio space, and both Zoe and Laurie communicate with her using Google Chat. So you can see here, it's quite a everyday conversation. The laptop doesn't turn on. Okay, what do we need to do? Did you hear my introduction? Which seems really mundane, but for a student whose anxiety is so high that she can't verbalize those things, this is really important. And these conversations just wouldn't be happening if we didn't have access to this tech. So she'll message on her phone or on the laptop, and we'll do the same. So we might be in the room with her while we're doing that. Or sometimes if her anxiety is so high, we'll be doing it from a separate space so that she's in a calm environment and feels kind of happy and comfortable to communicate with us that way. And then we're building this up slowly. So we've now got to a point where she's also comfortable using hand signals with us and making some eye contact. We've also been using it not just for her to talk with members of staff, but also other students that are in her class. With a few we identified had similar interest in kind of manga and anime that she did. And they've been chatting with her through Google Chat, even to the point where one learner would sit in the room with her talking via Google Chat. And it's been amazing. And it's made a whole sort of world available to her that she didn't have before. And it's taking time, and we're building it up slowly, but it means that something that she couldn't do previously is now really, looking far more possible. So yeah, Google Chat, amazing, or an equivalent of. It also, there's the mundane. The students will message me to tell me their bus is running late and they've forgotten their homework and all of those other things. That's also absolutely fine. But from an accessibility point of view, it just really helps those students who struggle to communicate in other ways. And then, comments as well. So I mentioned about leaving voice notes on students' work. We also use comments and comments bank through Google Slides and Google Docs to leave support for students to help to improve and develop their work. We swapped to digital sketchbooks as a result of COVID, and we've carried them on the last academic year because we found they've really helped us to improve the quality of students' written work in particular, because we've been able to kind of give them more support and guidance to expand and develop their sentences and their analysis in a way that we really couldn't with written work in the same way. So you can see here again, Zoe, my fabulous TA, has been putting comments in on a student's work. I've been putting comments in. Remember to use capital letters. You know, you could explain this further by talking about X, Y, and Z. And these exist right next to the student's slides. They can read them as many times as they like. They can reply to my comments as well if they want clarification of things. And when they've done it, they'll press that tick and I'll get an email to say, yep, they've done it. They've resolved the comment and I can go in and check. So particularly for kind of ongoing feedback, this is really useful. And it's a really clear evidence trail. It also means I find some students with additional needs are not always the most organised. Handwritten post-its and things do go missing or they get lost. This is a really clear, easy to find, trackable sort of system that they can use. And we'll use a combination of the moat notes and the written comments depending on what the students kind of prefer and what's going to work best for them. It's also all time stamped, which is really helpful. So you can say, oh, but on this day, I showed you this and here it is. And again, made marking much quicker. So a bonus. Right. So my other thing that I would recommend using, if you've never used before, is something called Screencastify. I use this all the time. This is a video of me explaining my students' checklist and project brief to them. So I've got a whole list of tasks on one side, I've got the criteria on the other, and my face in the corner. And what I'm doing is explaining every single bit of task and the criteria that relates to it. You can see it's also got captions on it so that my students can read what I'm saying as well as listening to it. And then I timestamp them as well so that students, when they're viewing them on YouTube, can go to task 1, task 2, task 3, whichever bit of the checklist is most relevant for them. So it means that throughout a project, students can refer back to this to know exactly what it is that I am asking from them, what they need to submit. I don't have to constantly answer the same questions about what they need to do because it's there and it's ready for them. I also send these to their parents because I find for a lot of my learners who do have additional needs, they quite often will get more support at home as well because parents are kind of maybe more in contact with the college than some. And I send these out to all my parents to say, this is what they're working on. This is what they're doing. If you want to watch this through, see where they're up to. If you've got any questions, you can let me know. Oh, thanks, Sky. Yes, extremely alternative. So it just means that you build up this bank of video content and tutorials, and you can use Screencastify to record any screen. So I've also used it for demonstrations for photo editing, how to upload files, how to submit work via Google Classroom, lots of different kind of everyday processes and systems that my students might need, which means they've got a video explanation of me going through it step by step. They can refer back to at any time that they like. And I think, as Sky was saying, having these bank of resources that you can refer back to and use over and over again is really valuable, and it ultimately saves us a huge amount of time in the long run. And if you're clever when you do your project briefs and you don't actually say the date that they hand in, you can use them for the next academic year as well. So yes, Screencastify or Stream is a great option for creating really good video content, and you don't have to have your face in it if you don't want to. You can just have the audio. Have I got? No, I think that's me done, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to scoot off because I've got to go and teach, but I'm going to leave you in Sky's capable hands.
Thanks so much, Becca. And I have included your Twitter handle at the end. So if anyone wants to follow up anything with Becca specifically about what she's doing in their department or the examples that she's given, I'll have it at the end. But I appreciate you have to go teach now. So thanks, Becca.
Cheers. Bye.
Okay, so for the last part of the webinar, I'm going to go over some of the key tools and resources, both those that are specific to Google and Microsoft, and then also some non-Google Microsoft specific ones that we use at the college. So I'm going to start with the G Suite ones, or Google Workplace, as I should say now, actually. My apologies to anyone here who's a core Microsoft user. The Microsoft section comes afterwards. At BCoT, we use a mixture of Google and Microsoft. And one of the reasons that we started using Google a lot is because we started introducing Chromebooks as a sort of cost-efficient alternative to getting lots of laptops out into the classrooms. And from an accessibility perspective, one of my favorite things about Chromebooks is how easy it is to access all of the different baked in, I think they call it, accessibility features. Now, I appreciate this slide is very busy, but this is just to give you a little overview of some of the things that we use and show in particular. So first of all, on the Chromebook is having select to speak. So this is something Chromebooks, anyone who's used one before, instead of caps lock, they have a kind of search icon key, which is quite frustrating to get used to, but that's also a shortcut for using as a screen reader. So whatever the students have accessed on a Chromebook, whether it's a web page or a document, they can use that key and the shortcut as this GIF goes on here, and then just select that text and that reads that aloud for them. So particularly for learners who need support reading chunks of text, that's really useful. And obviously the plus side of Chromebooks is that we don't have to have, students don't necessarily have to have headphones available. So in our support hub, we've got a few different rooms and like side rooms that learners can go into for individual working. And this is something that they can use there quite freely. Rather than some screen readers which read out all of the text, it just reads out the text that's highlighted. So it's really useful for students who need a bit of extra support but don't need help reading completely. Another thing that we use a lot around the college, which you can see my colleague Scott demonstrating in the top right, is voice typing. Now, voice typing is something that you can do natively in Google Docs and Slides, and also in the Microsoft equivalents. So in Microsoft Word, there's also a tab in the ribbon for voice typing. And again, this is something that for some of our students who struggle with written work more, it can be really useful for, but we also recommend it to all of our learners because it's just a different way of working. And particularly in a post-COVID era where we're trying to reduce our students' screen time, get them to be more mindful about the strain of looking at a computer all day, we quite often encourage our learners to use voice typing just to get their initial thoughts and ideas down on paper. In terms of accessibility though, a learner I was working with the year before last, I was booked in for a one-to-one from the learner support assistant, and I sat down with the learner and to show her different tools that she could use for writing her assignments. She had quite severe dyslexia and also quite high anxiety about writing due to previous negative experience in school. So I showed her lots of the different resources that are available. Obviously, we have access to digital screen overlays, which support her a bit. But the tool that she was the most excited about was Talk to Type. And that was because it meant that she could just get all of her thoughts and ideas onto the page without having the barrier of worrying every minute about why there was a red underline on everything. And then she could go back afterwards and go through it more forensically. But what she sort of reported to me was that even with different things that could support her with her spelling, she was finding that having to type things out meant that she was having to stop and start all the time. And when she was trying to recall information or trying to write about something for an assignment, that was just interrupting her sort of flow, as it were. So voice typing, really useful tool. And again, that's available sort of natively within Google Docs, Microsoft Word. All it requires is a microphone. So a lot of our learners have headphones that have built-in mics, and we encourage them to use those. But otherwise, most laptops have microphones in. And then we also have some in our digital team that we can provide our students with. So we also have, trying to remember what that's showing. Okay, that one. So down here is for translating documents as well. So again, that's another built-in feature. And then another really useful one is closed captions in Google Slides. And I know PowerPoint has a similar feature that came out a couple of years ago as well. And if you're working on a PC which has a mic in it, this actually live transcribes whilst you're presenting in a classroom. So if you have learners who are deaf or hard of hearing, then rather than only having captions on your video resources, you can actually do this in the classroom now. In terms of accessibility features on Chromebook, for anyone who's new to Chromebooks, one thing that's really useful just to get started is how you actually access them, because what you'll notice is it won't always appear on the menu straight away. So in a Chromebook, you access the menu in the bottom right-hand corner. And when you click on that, depending on the settings that are rolled out for your organization, you'll either have a little accessibility icon person here, or if you don't, you can go into the general settings and go into scroll down to the bottom to advanced, access accessibility here, and then just make sure it's toggled on to show that in the system. So for learners that we're working with who we know regularly use any of the features on the Chromebooks, if it's not showing, although by default on our domain now we have it rolled out so it should always show, but if they're having difficulty accessing it, we just go into the settings to make sure that it's always available there. And then whenever they want to access the accessibility menu to turn on settings, it's just 2 clicks away, bottom right menu, and then the accessibility icon. When they click on that icon, it pulls up this list of the baked-in features within Chromebooks. Now, some of these are obvious as to what they do. So Chromevox is a whole screen reader. Select to Speak is the one I just mentioned. So that's where learners can select a piece of text, a sentence or a word, and they'll get that read out to them. There's also dictation within Chromebooks themselves. So that allows learners to dictate in any environment, not just directly into a Google Doc or a Google Slide. High contrast mode. So for learners who have low vision or blindness, high contrast mode, you can select that and it will just immediately invert colors and change it to high contrast. That does affect web content, but in terms of actual docs and slides, it doesn't always convert them brilliantly. So there's a couple of extensions later on I'll show you where you can convert docs and slides to high contrast if that's needed. And then we also have 2 different types of magnifiers. So a full screen magnifier, which enlarges the whole screen, but also a docked magnifier, which is, for learners that I've worked with, tends to be the preference, because this magnifies the top half of the screen, but then on the bottom half of the screen, you can still see the whole page. So that enables you to see the context of where they are on the screen a lot easier. So the user can move their mouse around and hover over different parts of the screen, but they can also see the whole page at the bottom to see whereabouts on the screen they are. So automatic clicks, this is for people who have motor difficulties, and you can go into the settings in accessibility to change the timings on this. I believe by default it's about 3 seconds, and this means that learners, rather than having to click, they can hover their mouse somewhere, and if you leave it still for 3 seconds, that will click. And then finally, on-screen keyboard. So this is really useful, particularly as we have a lot of touch devices at the college. A lot of our learners prefer to use on-screen keyboards so that they can type it on the screen. But also on Chromebooks with touch devices, there's a draw option and handwriting recognition. And a lot of our learners who just aren't as used to typing or struggle to type using a keyboard prefer that, because it means that they don't have to navigate the layout of a keyboard. In terms of Microsoft baked-in accessibility, this poster here, I'm just going to share where this links to. So this is from the Microsoft Education Center, and this poster I think is really fantastic. And if you are a school or college that uses Microsoft, or you know any that do, I'd highly recommend using this resource. The Education Center covers all of the different features that Microsoft has. But this just gives a really good overview of the different features in the context of where they can be useful. So again, this is something, even though we use a lot of G Suite at BCoT, we use Microsoft as well. And this is something that I quite often share with teachers or new teachers, just to give them an overview of what's available in Microsoft. Go back to sharing my slides quickly. But in terms of some of the key features in Microsoft, Immersive Reader is, I think, the best sort of baked-in accessibility tool from any of the platforms, in my personal opinion. And I'm just going to open this now to give you an example of how it works for those who've not seen it. So Immersive Reader is built into a lot of the Microsoft products. So whether that's Word, OneNote, and also a lot of Microsoft partner products. So things like Wakelet, which is a partner of Microsoft, has Immersive Reader built in. And it's essentially a tool that opens up bits of text into a new window. Let's see. Yeah, still sharing this one. So this is the text that we saw in the previous window, but it's now opened up in Immersive Reader so that I can change the settings and interact with the page. So the first thing that's great about Immersive Reader is using it as something which reads out text.
Learning Tools Immersive Reader creates a reading experience.
On the most simple level, and I was playing with the speed earlier, but ordinarily
Experience that adds
it will
accessibility
read out
and comprehension.
at a more reasonable speed. My favorite thing about Immersive Reader is how customizable it is. So learners can adjust this. And again, it gives them the power and autonomy to make the resources how they best suit them. So over here, you can change the text size. You can add increased spacing. We can change the font and then also the themes. You can also add more colors. So if you've got learners who are used to using an overlay, then again, this is really useful for being able to customize it. In the second menu, you have grammar options. So again, this is particularly useful for learners for whom English isn't their first language, and also just generally embedding English. So you can actually highlight different parts of the text. This part isn't necessarily an accessibility feature, but it's just built into Immersive Reader. And then you also have the reading preferences. So you can add line focuses so that it only selects certain parts of the text. Picture dictionary, so that when you click on words, it includes that. Or even without picture dictionary, you can click on any of the words in the text and it gives you
Menu.
a readout of that word itself, and you can get the definitions as well. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through the last bits because I appreciate that we're coming up to time. But all of these are actually linked in the presentation as well. So I'll share these out afterwards. And all of these bits are hyperlinked. So another thing we use a lot is browser extensions. And two of the ones I'd like to highlight are NOverlay and Mercury Reader. These are available in both Chrome and Microsoft Edge. NOverlay is a really simple but flexible screen masking tool. So that can be added as an extension. You can save your preferences, so learners can pick from a color wheel what color overlay they want to use. And then that can be applied to any web page. And Mercury Reader is a screen simplifier. So this is something that's been quite a hit actually with a lot of learners who we've worked with who have ADHD and who struggle or who have other reasons that they struggle with their concentration or focus. And Mercury Reader basically declutters a page and puts it in a kind of simplified view. So again, it can be added as an extension. And if you go to any web page and click on that extension, you'll see in this bottom image here, you can adjust the text size and the typography. You can adjust the light or dark theme. And it also streamlines a page so you don't have adverts popping up all over the place. Accessibility on smartphones. There's a few different examples here, which again, I will share out. But it's just something, because in further education in particular, a lot of our learners are using smartphones to do their learning. So another thing that we try to disseminate to our learners is the features that they have built in, whether they have Apple, Androids, or other devices. And read and write as well. I'm sure many people in the accessibility sphere will already be familiar with this tool, but this is a tool that we use and we show all of our learners. It's available with Microsoft or Google. And again, this links out to their website for you to have another look. Just going to skip across to the CPD. So the last two slides. Now, as I said, there's really good sort of CPD out there from different websites, but also whether you're from a Google or a Microsoft organization, there's some really brilliant free online CPD that I just wanted to draw your attention to. So on Microsoft Learning Center, there's a really good Microsoft pathway course. Each sort of segue of it is about an hour long, but that covers in a lot of depth all of the different tools and different ways to use them and apply them. And from the Google side as well, if you go onto the Google Accessibility website, they have a Tools for Diverse Learning training course, which again covers all of the different features in the Google products and also in Chromebooks. And finally, for a non-product specific kind of view, there are some really fantastic resources on the ETF Enhanced platform. And these cover lots of different elements of accessibility, but from a non-sort of product specific angle. And these are only about 10-15 minutes long each. This is one of the training programs we actually rolled out for all of our staff at the college. So sorry for running slightly over. I'm going to stop the recording now. And if anyone has any questions, please do feel free to drop them in the chat.
No, thank you. That was really interesting to see how